Hello. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you guys gathered on this cold Wednesday for a time of literature. Um, my name is Delight Ejiaka. I am the virtual events assistant for Black Mountain Institute. BM- BMI thanks its supporters, Beverly Rogers, Miriam Sharing, and the Rogers Foundation. This program is also co-sponsored by the Beverly Theater, Nevada Council for the Arts, National Endowments for the Arts. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I'll be introducing Pemi Aguda shortly. Then, after her reading and conversation, she will take a few questions from the audience. Pemi's book will be available for sale and signing after the event. Please also join BMI if you can at upcoming events, including a talk with Dr. Mandy Gray on February 5th at 4 p.m. And I will call you once I arrive in Kiev an evening with Moreno Ravenpour and Miriam Allen Amjadi on February 11th. Free registration and full details are available at blackmountain.org. The University of Nevada, Las Vegas wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and recognize that the university is situated on traditional homelands of the Nuwu Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in continued learning about the indigenous people who work, live on this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Moapa Band of Paiutes. Pemi Aguda is from Lagos, Nigeria. She has an MFA from the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan. Her writing has won many awards and recognitions, including an O'Hare Prize, and her work has been supported by the Octavia Butler Memorial Scholarship and a MacDowell Fellowship. Her novel In Progress won the 2020 Deborah Rogers Foundation Writers Award, and she was a 2021 Fiction Fellow with the Miami Book Fair. Her debut collection, Ghostroots, was a finalist for the National Book Awards for Fiction, amongst many honors. The world in Ghostroots is flexible, so language stretches to reflect the collapse of default realities. Language is specific and not used in a smush of rhetoric jargon that conveys nothing. Everything is possible in a way that collapses the fourth wall and submerges the reader into the hollow. The paranormal and the mundane tango in a dance whose next steps you cannot foresee because the beauty is not in the intricacy of language, but in its freedom and seamless fluidity. Everyone, welcome Pemi Aguda.
Thanks, Delight. I was delighted by that introduction. I'm sorry I had to do it. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy. It's my first time in Las Vegas, and I feel very happy to be here. I feel very welcome. Everybody has been so nice, and special shout out to Charlotte, who has been so kind since the very first email. I was like, I can't wait to meet that person. So what I'm going to do is read a short, very, very short story in its entirety, and then I'll read an excerpt of a second one. And the first one is called Contributions. We have been practicing Esusu for a long time. Our mothers did it, our mothers' mothers did it, and probably their own mothers too. We've never had a problem of this kind before. Nothing so significant before this woman showed up, nothing we couldn't fix anyway. This is how our system works. Each woman has 1 month to contribute a certain amount of naira. Our names are on a list, and when that month is over, whoever's number one takes it all. Then the contributions begin again, and at the end of the second month, number two collects. The names are always in random order. We go down the list until the last person has collected, then resets. This works for us. We don't need your banks, we don't need your loans, we can take care of ourselves. Things aren't always smooth. There was a time Iya Ibeji wasted her collection on a trip to Dubai, camel rides and shopping, and then couldn't make her contribution the next month. We had to seize her frozen food stores generator until she came up with the money. We are not wicked people, you must understand, but for this system to work, there has to be order. Another time, Mrs. B had to pay hospital bills for her son's operation. If we show pity even once, our structure will collapse on itself. So we seized Mrs. B's daughter. The daughter made meals for us. She carried our bags when we went to the markets, relieving us of some burdens. She rubbed our feet and plaited our hair. When Mrs. B raised the money, we sent her daughter back home. We still have fond memories of the girl. Her sweet face, her spicy beef stew, the way she sprang lightly from foot to foot as if her bones were made of paper. Ours is a small group, we must be, for trust, for reliability. Not just anyone will accept our terms of admittance, both lifelong and strict. We take what we can until your obligations are met, and for many, this is too much power, too much risk. We haven't invited you here, we tell the ones who balk at our terms, their heads tilted at beseeching angles. Go try your luck at the banks. We've worked too hard to allow any stupid leniency that could risk sending us back to the gutters. So when the new woman came, sniffing at our meetings with her long nose, we warned her. We asked if she was certain. Yes, she said. She needed an alternative to the banks. Yes, she said she was sure. She was a cousin to one of our brother's best friends, so we said okay, even if we were hesitant. Our hands filling with wrappers, our chests tight, we welcomed her. At first, things went smoothly. Nonsense hardly ever shows itself immediately. She paid her contributions on time. She came to the meetings and drank Fanta and ate chin-chin with us. She weighed in on decisions like what color to wear to Sisi Oge's daughter's wedding, pink or burgundy, and whether we should collectively stop patronizing Nature's Way Spa because the owner elbowed one of us on the way to get communion at church. But by the 4th month, she started leaving texts on our phones, begging for more time. Look, it doesn't work this way. We appraised her life, checking for what we could seize, what we could take from her so she would understand the gravity of this commitment. We found nothing except a husband and an old mother in the village. We seized the husband. Alas, he was useless around our homes. He sat with our husbands, his big bare belly and their big bare bellies all shuddering gelatinously in mirth at some distasteful joke. Her husband screamed at football games with ours, played table tennis in our gardens, whooping like a fool whenever the ball thwacked against the paddle in his hand. Sometimes he looked at us. He looked at us and reminded us of the expanse of our hips, the heft of our breasts, reminded us of the ways our bodies take up space. We returned the husband and still she couldn't pay her contribution, so we seized her mother. Her mother was no better. The old woman sat brooding in corners, her eyes bulging out at us as we picked beans or sewed a button on. She blended in with the cobwebs, her skin acquiring a dark fuzz, a gleaming scaliness, exploiting the shifting shadows. And when she eventually turned into a frog, and then a lizard, and then a cat, our children squealed in delight. But when they tried to pet the cats, she scratched their hands, drawing blood, leaving scars in the shapes of a strange language. She leaped away from our punishing arms to perch high above our heads, and we craned our necks to look at her, envying the fluffy agility, the way she could wrangle her body into a smaller, lighter version of itself, stealthy and wily and out of reach. We sent the mother away and called the woman in. What else could she give us to hold on to until she could make her contribution? We sat her in the center of the group so she could feel our glares prick her skin from every direction, feel the pressure of our disappointment. Look, she said, will you take my arms? Her arms were long and muscular and had known work. We accepted them. They were useful in our kitchen, these arms, chopping ugu leaves here, stirring a pot of ewedu there, pounding yams, slicing apples. They were useful in the household, sweeping dust down the corridor, rocking a child to sleep. Sometimes the arms wrapped around us when our husbands were yelling, or when the children were crying again, or when the sky looked the wrong shade of blue. But still, she couldn't make her contributions, so we held onto her arms. My legs, she asked, when the next month she still couldn't pay. She sat armless, collapsed boba sleeves at her sides in the middle of the circle, her head bowed so that her braids hid her face from our questioning eyes. We had never seen such ineptitude before, such resignation to humiliation. But her legs were sturdy, with firm calves that could kick a football with her sons, and strong knees that braced our daughters' heads when we plaited their hair, and a lap that received our heads when we wept because the sky was still the wrong shade of blue, and our eyeballs felt heavy in our heads. My torso, she offered. My head, she contributed. Her voice got airier with each new part given. And what use were these breasts, this stomach, this heavy head filled with skull? But we took and we took and we took. It wasn't until we had all her body parts that we saw what she had done. Had we too not wanted to shed our parts, to be lighter, be nothing, be free? Would we also not give anything to have our bodies no longer belong to us? Now we do not speak about it because we are too ashamed to acknowledge how she deceived us into carrying her, bearing her weight forever, her sinew and bones and teeth and muscle and breath and blood. We avoid each other's eyes as we discuss contributions and collections. When we shuffle out of meetings, our shoulders hunch, our treads drag from the burden of her, from carrying what we have taken. Okay, gonna take a sip of water. The next story is called The Hollow. I won't read it in its entirety, but what you should know is that it goes back and forth into alternate timelines. In the present timeline, a young architect shows up at a house to measure for the as-built drawings. Does anybody know what that means? I guess it doesn't matter. And then in the past timeline, it is the woman who built the house. The woman who built the house. Okay, this is The Hollow. The house is ugly, Arita decides when the taxi drops her off in front of her new assignment. Too many roofs clambering over each other like crowded teeth, and flicking walls the pink of a tongue. She shrugs her tote bag higher and knocks on a gate so black she checks her knuckles for soot. A young boy, maybe 15 or 16, opens to the sound. She's from the architecture firm, she explains, here to measure for the renovations. And is Madame Oni available? He waves her in. Madame Oni isn't home, but Arit can proceed with her tasks. She nods and he retreats to the backyard, leaving her alone. She scratches at the inside of a wrist. Arit faces the house, and the house faces her. She loosens another shirt button. Even the breeze is balmy, a warm exhalation. She crosses the compound, surveying, analyzing, an overgrown garden, a strange tint of green, and a gaping carport with no cars, gravel that scatters under her tennis shoes, and fences that loom too high, lean too close to the two-level building. Her brain is already simmering with solutions, although she will not design this remodel. She's new at the firm, 1 year out of university, which means she will be doing the grunt work, measuring until she earns trust. She slings the office camera around her neck, clips the measuring tape at her waist. What is a house? What do we want from it? What makes it beautiful? Arit's uncle, the man who wooed her to architecture, told her that only when she could answer the questions for herself and for her clients should she take pencil to paper. The front door opens at her touch and she enters, looking. A long time ago, there was a woman who lived elsewhere in the city. What is a house, this woman wondered, as her husband dragged her body like a mop over faded linoleum floors, but a pressure cooker, a vent pipe screaming steam. The woman who lived in a pressure cooker had married a man who waited to reveal the evil festering in his guts. It oozed forth after a few years of marriage in the form of mistresses, gifts bought for them with the woman's money, as fists to her cheekbones, a foot in her belly, full pots of soup flung at walls, okra sliding down like tears, doors locking her out after trips to the market, doors splintered in the middle of the night. This woman had a son, and as she stowed him away in cupboards to save him from his father's cruelty, under beds, behind chairs, she wondered, what is a house but a large handbag with many hidden zippers and pockets? From the outside, Madame Oni's house is comprehensible. With Lucky eagerly holding one end of the measuring tape, Arid's side plan and perimeter measurements come together in little more than an hour. She looks up at the house again. The pointed arches of the windows will be better suited to a church, a sanctuary, a building that evil skirts around, passes over. On the inside, Madame Oni has disappeared, and Arid's calculations still don't add up. She checks and rechecks lengths and widths and heights and never gets the same reading twice. The tape retracts into itself and bites her fingers again and again. This uncertainty, this shiftiness, this impossibility causes a ringing in her head. Unmoored, dizzy, she feels as if the walls are the floor and she's leaning against the ceiling, her torso wedged into a window frame. A fear clunks up her ribs, a fear that nothing is real and everything is upside down and elementally wrong. What does it mean for a house to be fixed? Arit wonders. To make firm, stable, or stationary. To repair, to set in order or in good condition. To put in a position to make no further trouble. The woman who lived in the large handbag with many pockets made a plan. She sold Ashoebi from a tiny shop in Balogun Market, saving all the profits, every tip. She sold Zobo at church events and Ofada rice at community gatherings, the sun darkening her skin, firewood smoke staining her lungs. She opened a bank account, hid the multiplying money from her husband, whose character grew weaker, and the power in his swings and his words stronger. She bought land in a part of Lagos that wouldn't become popular for another 18 years, a part she had to access on foot because the closest bus stop was 20 minutes away. She hired an eager draftsman who advertised his services in colorful letters under bridges. And when it was time to build, she oversaw the project herself, breathing her fear into the foundation, sweating her resolve into the concrete walls. She rinsed herself at the site so her husband wouldn't smell new beginnings on her. Soon, no more, she chanted in her head every night he added a scar to her skin. Every night she added a terrified scream to her son's memory. When the last shingle was nailed to the roof, the woman put her son on her back and left, taking nothing else. That first night, they slept on the bare floor, burrowing into each other. A house is freedom. A house is an escape. This one sensed their dread, their relief, and stood vigilant, ready to protect. How can you know a house if you don't sleep in it? Some say that light is the success of any building, but what new angles might darkness reveal? The woman who lived in the house of freedom was found by her husband. On that lot so far away from everything, he climbed the gates, breaching the perimeter, cutting his shin, trailing blood across the compound. He broke a lock, nothing but death swelling in his chest, coating his throat. The house bristled defensively around the sleeping mother and son, inhaling and exhaling, and the man felt the draft on his neck, on the meat of his hand gripping the knife. He moved from room to room hunting, but every turn took him back to where he began. The walls shifted and the floors wavered, and he was bewildered. Each door led to a hallway that led to a dead end, the sharp arches of glass twinkling at him, promising pain. Exhausted and dizzy, he leaned into a corner, seeking an anchor, protection, though from what he didn't know. He felt a loss of control. The house balked at his weight, at his entitlement to support. It closed in on him, deviating and rearranging itself until a hollow appeared, between walls, between floors, between walls, and there the intruder was folded in, trapped, never to hurt again. A house can be a prison too. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for reading that. Yeah, I have some questions. And let's talk about Hollow, the story you just read. It won the O. Henry Prize. And I taught it to my creative writing class, and they marveled at how you lay out all the multiple timelines and everything. There is the architect, there's the landlady and her backstory, and there's the house, which is the central character. It's a very compact story with many layers. So how did you work in all the layers and timelines and narrative? How was that process like?
It was very, very many drafts. I think story process for me changes from story to story. There are some stories that come out fully formed. This one was not one of them. It had very, very many iterations. the very first draft of the story, I think, was about a boyfriend and a girlfriend. The boy does something wrong and gets trapped in his girlfriend's head. And I'm like, why?
I want to read that story.
But then I was like, why would you punish her by trapping him in her head? And so it went through different cycles. At some point, the house itself was a speaker. The house was the one who was narrating the story. And I think even when you jettison an idea for a draft, there's something about that that lingers. And I think it was useful for me to write the story from the point of view of the house, for example, because then when I got to this version, to see how definite the house was about it. The house is very strict in this book. And I think it was useful for me to have written a draft in the voice of the house at first before I was able to get to that point. So the short answer is just tons of drafts. Yeah.
Yeah, I liked hearing that process of the house being a character and from his perspective. That was really interesting. And then contributions. I really love that story. And the opening lines, our mothers did it, our mothers did it, and probably their own mothers too. We've never had a problem of this kind before. Nothing so significant before this woman showed up. Nothing we can't fix anyway. So the mothers in this story, do you think they were proof of how these ladies handled the situation at the end?
I think that's an interesting question. I can't speak for these mothers, but probably because these women are doing what they're doing because their mothers did it that way. And this is kind of how tradition works. We watch somebody act a certain way, watch somebody do a certain amount of things, and then you just repeat it, or you decide not to repeat it. I mean, my own mom was part of so in Yoruba we call this ajo. The whole idea where it's like an informal money cooperative where people put down money and then somebody, like the story said, I already described it in the story. But my mom was part of one of these groups, and it will give me so much anxiety because we have such different attitudes towards risk. Whereas she, once she got her own, check, she's like, I'm going to create a new business. I'm going to start a new idea. And I'm like, just can you keep half of it so that when it's time for you to pay back, you can pay? She's like, that's not the idea. The idea is for you to go big and do something wild. So my reaction to my mother, I guess, is reacting away from how she would have reacted. But for the most part, I think a lot of what we do is repeated because of what we've seen. So I don't know how these mothers would have reacted specific, but I think a lot of people just do what their moms did because that's what culture is, that's what tradition is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that even that's a theme and a thread I see in the story, like lineage happening. And then in Manifest and Imagine Me Carrying You, we have these two mothers who are in a sense like carrying like hereditary like mental illness that like you see it play out with time and they pass it along to their children. Is that an example of domestic horror?
Yes.
Expand more on that.
What's the question?
I'm thinking like, how do you see like that? Because imagine me carrying you. You're in the house. The girl is in the house. I don't want to spoil it, but like the mom is going through a transformation.
Oh, we can spoil it. That story doesn't.
Okay,
we can spoil that story.
Yeah, the mom is going through a transformation, and you can see it in real time being transferred to the child, like just like seeing that change happening in the mother.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just thinking like that domestic sphere is not really written about a lot, right? So how do you like think through that process of this is something that's happening in real time? Is that an example of domestic horror? How do you think about that?
Okay, so I will spoil. It's not a spoiler. Imagine Me Carry. Okay, Manifest is a story for those who haven't read it. It's a story where the main character starts getting these pimples on her face, and every time she gets a pimple, she does something bad, and then the pimple goes away, and she's like, ooh, and then she becomes progressively bad, and then we find out that her grandmother, her mother's mother, was an evil woman. And so her mother, every time her mother looks at her, she sees her own mother in her face. And then Imagine Me Carrying You, which is the second story that Delight is referring to. The mother in the story has an accident and kills a young girl. And then the whole story is basically watching her unravel, and her daughter is witnessing her unravel, just saying, "Mommy, like, get yourself together."
Yeah.
Personally, I think when I was in my early 20s, I was starting to realize that I am my mother. And that is a horror story, my friends.
Exactly.
I just was starting to think about how so much of what we do, like, again, is just repeated. Or sometimes I will do something, my mom be like, "Oh, that reminds me of my mom." And so there's a way that we are. My friend describes it as being like epigenetically haunted. So there's a way that we're being haunted
By our mothers.
by all the ancestors we don't know, and you don't even know that you're being haunted. But for me, the horror part of it was I was at the age where I was like, I want to be my own person. I want to be an individual, and I was starting to realize that maybe is not possible. So that's the horror for me. It's just what is me, what is inherited. Is it possible to separate yourself from everything that came before you? Is it fair to be asking such questions? So yeah, that's
Thank you. That was a very in-depth answer. Yes. Um, and I feel like in your work, you test what is possible, like emotionally and narratively. So for example, when you're working on a story and there's like 5 possible directions, like when you mentioned in Hollow, there's 5 possible directions. Do you like try out all the directions, or do you like collapse all the possibilities in one angle? So like you go like, oh, this is what the story wants. Let me try out all the possible directions. I feel like you've mentioned that a little bit. Or do you like say, let me just take this direction and go with it? So how do you decide?
um, it changes from story to story, but I don't necessarily think that there are multiple direct. I think usually there's a story I want to tell, and then it depends on who is going to tell the story, and then who is telling the story changes the direction of the story. And so once I figured out who is telling the story, then the direction is chosen, is selected for me. I'm sorry that that was so short. But
No,
that's the
no, yeah,
answer.
that's perfect. Yes. Okay, this is Masquerade Season, the last story in this collection. It kind of reminds me of 24th Alaji William Street. Both stories, in a sense, echo a mother-son relationship that like changes over time. And so I was trying to decide, like, how do you decide which stories, like, how did you decide which story to end the collection on? Because I feel like for me as a reader, I was like, oh, 24 William Street, I really love that. So I was like, oh, maybe this should be the end. But I was curious to like hear like how you decided like Masquerade Season to end that on.
Okay, so I wrote this. I wrote a version of this collection for my thesis. Um, I know. Okay, I wasn't going to say this, but you know, we're not supposed to be reading reviews. But I read somebody on Goodreads was like, "This reads like a thesis thing," and I was like, "Yes, it was a thesis book. So what? Why is that a diss? Why?" Um, but over time, the stories shuffled around. So I had a version that I did for thesis. I had a version that I had with my agents. I had a version that I did with my editor when the time came. But I remember when I was in thesis, my thesis leader, Peter Ho Davis, who's wonderful, we had different meetings, and at some point he asked he asked me to come up with a title for the collection that encapsulated the themes but wasn't a story title. It was a mental exercise. But he also was talking about how a lot of stories in this book, a lot of characters feel trapped in their lives or by genetics or in the country, or there's a feeling of being trapped. And then he said it would be a good thing if the last story in the collection gestured to some kind of freedom or some kind of escape. And to him, that meant maybe trying to write a story set in the US. And I was like, no, that's not my answer. But I looked at what I already I didn't write Masquerade Season in the MFA. I wrote it at Clarion. but without spoiling it, there's kind of an there's a gesture towards freedom that happens at the end.
Yes.
And I thought that might be, hopefully, it's maybe bittersweet, but I hope that there's some kind of expulsion of freedom that, people feel when they get to that story.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, in a sense, like warm-hearted after everything. Like, it just feels like a good note. Yes.
Yeah.
Like you've mentioned a little bit, I feel like your stories like told the line between like the speculative and then and reality. Like it like kind of like blurs that line a little bit, even with contributions to a sense. Our current reality does not feel real. How do you like think about the distinction between the speculative and and what is real? How do you think about that?
So I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, where one of the stories in this book is called Bird Woman. And in the story, a woman literally turns into a bird and then falls. This is a story I read in a magazine, like a Nigerian magazine, reported as real. About the way it was reported was that a bird had flown into an electrical wire and fell as a woman, and then she got arrested. Why? I don't know why she got arrested. But this was reported as fact. And there are so many stories like that. A woman giving birth to a yam, that's reported as fact. And I guess growing up in a situation or in context where the supernatural is mundane, I kind of absorbed that. But for me, when I use supernatural conceits in a story, it isn't necessarily about the conceit itself. Like, I don't care about whether or not it's real that a woman turned into a bird. I'm more interested in what else that situation can bring out. Like, this character is a woman who, when you realize has like feelings about like the weight of being a human. And then so what happens when somebody who is so belabored by that gets to experience flight? That's more interesting to me about whether or not it's real. But I think it's useful for there to be flexibility in what we think is real or not. The types of stories that I tend to be drawn to in terms of what I like to read is stuff that's more or less set in reality, but there's something askew. And I think there's something interesting that happens when a character is destabilized. When you go out into the world thinking, this is what I expect, and then something strange happens, there's something in that disorientation that's interesting to me, and what it can open to you as yourself because you are destabilized.
Yeah, that's a very good way to think about that. And I'm thinking of like, you mentioned like some of the stories you read and some of the stories you like. What are your like current fixations in like popular media and culture, like shows, TV shows that you feel like, in a sense, like just inhabiting your brain space?
You know, when you ask us questions, everything goes away, right? But in general, I really like cult shit, like things where, you know, people are trapped in a school, in a convent, I don't know, and then strange things happen. I just saw Blink Twice by Zoe Kravitz. Does anybody know that? Yeah. I mean, it felt familiar, but I'm like, I'm here for the ride because that's my genre. I'll sit down for it. Yeah.
No, yes, yeah. I think also like murder mysteries. You watch any of those?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
I see what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yes. I do love a murder. I love murder mysteries. There's a story in here called Things Boys Do. That was literally inspired by a murder mystery. I love murder mysteries, not the cozy kind, but not the grim kind either. I like somewhere just in the middle. I like sprawling green fields. And it's great if it's a little bit old timey. Give me some costumes. I want to feel bad for the killer at the end of the episode because it's so real, you know. I don't like people who are cast in, I don't like stereotypes. I want the reason this person did this thing to be compelling. I want to be crying for the murderer at the end of the story.
Now you have to give us some recs. Now you've described this so well. We need recommendations if you can think of any.
I really like Endeavor. The last season of Vera just showed. So these are all these are all murder mysteries online. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So after this book came out last year, and there has been a big press run with it. So how do you balance like the public aspect of being an author and like the private part, which is more of a vocation? Do they like influence each other? Do they like help in any way? Or are they like distinct and you have to like just prep for them differently, which you have to, but how do you like balance both sides of the job?
I have to confess it was really hard. I think my first few events after the book came out, I felt so emotionally drained. I didn't realize that talking about a book meant that I would be talking about myself, and I hadn't prepared for that. And so, after I remember having this excellent conversation with my friend Molly in New York, and afterwards, I just didn't want to see anybody for a while because I was like, I went too deep. I exposed so much of myself. And people were like, you didn't expose that much. I was like, no, I feel raw. I feel open. So it's hard, but I think that I've done the work, which is writing the book. Everything else is just extra. I just have to keep reminding myself everything else is extra. The work is done. The answers are in the book. I think I am my smartest and most eloquent on the page. Everything else is extra. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for those great answers. Round of applause for Pemi, everyone. Yes, so remember we have a book signing outside. Get copies of Ghostroots. See you guys.